It was an ordinary evening, one of those quiet nights where the world feels safe and familiar. Families gathered around dinner tables, the smell of home-cooked meals drifting through open windows, and laughter mixing with the hum of televisions. But behind closed doors, in homes scattered across different corners of the country, something far darker was unfolding. The kind of darkness that doesn't just shatter lives, it erases them. Tonight, we are stepping into some of the most chilling and unthinkable tragedies in recent history. 7 family massacre cases that defy logic and leave us asking questions with no easy answers. These aren't just headlines pulled from old newspapers. They are real stories of real people, mothers, fathers, children, whose lives were cut short in ways no one could have imagined. You might think you've heard it all before, but what you're about to hear will test how much you really believe you understand about human nature. In each case, there was no warning, or at least none that anyone recognized. A smiling father at a weekend barbecue. A teenage son who seemed quiet but polite. A neighbor who always waved from the driveway. On the surface, these were households that looked like any other, blending into the rhythm of normal life. And yet, beneath that surface, secrets were growing like cracks in a wall. Tiny at first, but deep enough to eventually bring everything crashing down. What drives someone to turn on the very people they share their life with? Was it years of hidden resentment? A moment of blind rage? Or something darker, something no one ever saw coming? In these stories, motives range from the twisted to the inexplicable. Some involve financial struggles and broken relationships. Others are tangled in jealousy, betrayal, or obsession. But they all share one haunting truth. The danger didn't come from outside. It came from within. As we explore these cases, we'll walk through the moments leading up to each tragedy, the small details that now seem like warnings in hindsight, and the ripple effects that shattered entire communities. We'll hear from neighbors who still can't make sense of it, from investigators who were faced with scenes they'll never forget, and from surviving family members left to carry the weight of what happened. And yet, for all the facts and timelines, there's one thing that remains stubbornly out of reach: the why. Because when you strip away the sensational headlines and police reports, what's left is the chilling reality that sometimes the people we trust the most can be the ones we know the least. In the next few minutes, you'll hear about a Sunday morning that began with pancakes and ended in chaos. About a family reunion that never made it to dessert. About a late-night phone call that should have been nothing more than a wrong number, but instead became the start of a nightmare. These are not easy stories to hear. They are heavy, unsettling, and at times almost unbelievable, but they are true. And once you know them, you can't unknow them. So take a breath, settle in, and remember this. What you're about to hear didn't happen in far-off places to people you'd never relate to. It happened in towns like yours, to families not so different from yours. And in one of these 7 cases, there's a detail so strange, so haunting, that even the most seasoned detectives couldn't agree on what it meant. By the end, you might think you have the answers. But as you'll soon find out, the truth can be far more complicated than the crime itself. The first case takes us to a small suburban neighborhood that, at first glance, could have been pulled straight from a postcard. Neatly trimmed lawns, mailboxes standing like sentries at the edge of driveways, and rows of houses where every window seemed to glow warmly at night. Everyone knew everyone. At least, that's what they thought. Neighbors waved. Kids played basketball in the cul-de-sac, and summer barbecues brought nearly every household together. It was the kind of place where you wouldn't lock your doors unless you were going away for the weekend. At the center of this story was the Harding family. Michael Harding was a well-liked high school teacher, known for staying late to help his students and organizing the annual charity drive. His wife, Rebecca, worked part-time at the local library, where she had a smile for every patron and a knack for remembering exactly what book you were looking for. Their 2 children, Daniel and Sophie, were involved in everything from soccer practice to piano recitals. On the surface, they were the picture of stability. But as we begin to look closer, tiny fractures start to appear. Michael had recently taken on extra work, tutoring in the evenings and on weekends. Some friends chalked it up to his dedication, but others quietly wondered if the family was struggling financially. Rebecca, normally warm and talkative, had grown quieter over the past year. At the library, She kept her conversations short and avoided eye contact with colleagues she used to chat with for hours. Daniel, once an easygoing teen, had started skipping soccer practice. Sophie, still in elementary school, was often seen sitting alone on the swings at recess, watching the ground instead of playing with her friends. The Hardings had their routines, but small deviations began to stand out. A neighbor noticed their car parked in the driveway well into the afternoon on weekdays, when Michael and Rebecca were usually at work. Another recalled seeing Michael standing at the kitchen window late at night, staring out at the street with an expression she couldn't quite read. It was easy to dismiss these moments at the time. After all, people go through rough patches. But when everything came to a sudden and tragic end, those same moments became the pieces of a puzzle no one could fully put together. In the days before the incident, there were subtle signs that something was wrong. Signs so small they slipped under the radar. Rebecca called her sister in another state, asking about a guest room, just in case she needed a break. Daniel had a strange conversation with a friend in which he mentioned things at home being different. Sophie's teacher noticed her drawings had shifted from bright colors to darker tones, but children's moods change, and it was brushed aside. On the night before the tragedy, the Hardings' home appeared perfectly calm from the outside. The curtains were drawn, lights glowed softly in the living room, and a faint sound of laughter drifted through an open upstairs window. A neighbor walking their dog later said they'd paused for a moment, thinking how peaceful it all seemed. But inside, tensions were quietly reaching a breaking point. When dawn broke, the neighborhood would never be the same again. Police cars, flashing lights, and yellow tape turned that postcard-perfect street into a scene from which people still avert their eyes when they pass by. Even now, no one agrees on exactly what happened in those final hours. The official reports provide a timeline, but the motive remains frustratingly unclear. Those who knew the family best insist there were no real warning signs, while others can't help but revisit every small, strange moment from the weeks before, wondering how they didn't see it coming. The second case takes us hundreds of miles away, to a quiet farmhouse on the edge of a rural town. The Miller family had lived there for generations, their land stretching out in wide, rolling fields. James Miller ran the farm with the help of his 2 adult sons, while his wife, Claire, handled the household and the farm's bookkeeping. They were known in town as dependable and hard-working, always willing to lend a hand to neighbors in need. But the isolation of rural life has a way of hiding things. Friends say the Millers were private, but in the months before the tragedy, that privacy seemed to turn into distance. They stopped attending church regularly, and James began declining invitations to local gatherings. The few times he was seen in town, he seemed distracted, his mind somewhere else. Claire was spotted more often at the post office, mailing large envelopes addressed to unknown recipients. No one thought much of it at the time. Every family has its quirks, but later, those details would become points of endless speculation. One evening, a storm rolled across the fields, lightning flashing against the darkened farmhouse windows. A friend called to check in, but no one answered. By morning, the Millers' land was quiet, but not in the usual, peaceful way. A neighbor noticed that the farm's truck was still parked by the barn, its door slightly ajar. The animals hadn't been fed. Something about the stillness felt wrong. When the news broke, it rattled the entire county. Law enforcement described the scene in careful, measured terms. But behind those official words lay the grim reality that something unimaginable had taken place in the middle of the night. As with the Hardings, there were questions without answers. Was it connected to money troubles, a family dispute, or something much more complicated, tangled in the private history of the Millers themselves? Even years later, theories still circulate in whispers among locals, none of them entirely satisfying. The third case shifts to a bustling city apartment complex where residents live just feet away from each other. Yet somehow, an entire family story unraveled without anyone noticing. The Ramirez family occupied a small but cozy unit on the 6th floor. Miguel worked at a local auto shop, while his wife, Elena, stayed home with their 2 young children. They were polite, kept to themselves, and were considered good tenants. City life offers anonymity, and the Ramirezes seemed to embrace it. But in the weeks leading up to the incident, neighbors began to hear muffled arguments through the thin walls. A woman's voice, strained but controlled, and a man's voice in short, clipped responses. The sounds never lasted long and always ended in silence. So people let it go. In a building with hundreds of tenants, disagreements weren't unusual. One neighbor recalls a chilling moment just days before the tragedy, passing Elaine in the hallway and noticing she looked as if she hadn't slept in days. When asked if she was all right, she smiled faintly and said, "Everything's fine. It's just been a lot lately." It was a sentence so ordinary it could mean anything, but in hindsight, it now feels heavy with unspoken meaning. The night everything changed, no one in the building reported hearing anything unusual. The only sign that something was wrong came the next morning, when the children didn't show up for school and Miguel didn't clock in at work. By noon, a property manager was knocking on their door. What was found inside became the center of a long, complex investigation, one that drew in multiple agencies and uncovered layers of the family's life that no one on the outside had ever suspected. With each of these cases, the pattern is hauntingly similar: outward normalcy, small, almost invisible changes in behavior, a final night that appears calm to the outside world, and then a moment when everything crosses an invisible line, leaving only questions in its wake. As we move forward, the stories become even stranger, details that defy explanation, timelines that don't quite fit, and in one case, a message left behind that investigators still can't agree on whether it was a warning, a confession, or something else entirely. These are stories that remind us of one unsettling truth. Sometimes, the people we think we understand the most are the ones we never truly knew at all. As investigators dug deeper into the Harding case, they began piecing together a more complicated picture than anyone in the neighborhood had imagined. Financial records showed that Michael had recently taken out a second loan on the house, something he hadn't mentioned to friends or family. The extra tutoring jobs, the late nights. Suddenly they seemed less like dedication and more like desperation. But when detectives asked Rebecca's sister about that strange phone call days before the tragedy, she revealed something unsettling. Rebecca hadn't just been looking for a break. She had asked if she could bring the children with her before things got worse. Worse from what? No one knew, and Rebecca never got the chance to explain. At the same time, friends described Michael as calm and collected, someone who didn't lose his temper easily. If there were tensions in the home, they were carefully hidden behind polite smiles. This left police with conflicting accounts. On one side, the image of a family under financial and emotional strain, and on the other, a picture of people who seemed in control. The truth lay somewhere in between, but every person who tried to guess came up with a different answer. In the Miller case, the main conflict seemed to be buried in the history of the land itself. While James Miller was known for his hard work, there had been rumors, quiet ones, about old disputes with relatives over ownership. Town records showed a complicated chain of inheritance, with several extended family members having once claimed rights to parts of the farm. It was the kind of thing most people forgot about, but to those involved, it had been a point of pride and tension for decades. Whether those old disputes had anything to do with what happened was impossible to prove, but investigators couldn't ignore the possibility. Claire's frequent trips to the post office also raised questions. The envelopes she sent were traced to addresses in different states, but their contents remain a mystery. Some speculated they contained legal documents. Others thought they might have been letters to someone from her past. Her sister told police that Claire had once confided in her about feeling trapped, though she never said by what. That single word, trapped, stuck with investigators. It hinted at something more personal, something that might not be written in any financial records or land deeds. In the Ramirez case, the central conflict seemed to center on pressures that had been building quietly for months. Elena's friends told detectives she had been trying to convince Miguel to move out of the city, saying it would be better for the children. Miguel, however, loved his job and didn't want to start over somewhere else. The arguments overheard to the walls may have been about more than just location. They may have been about the direction of their entire life together. But the more police looked, the more contradictions they found. Miguel's co-workers described him as stressed but excited about a possible promotion, while Elena's relatives said she had been packing away certain items as if preparing for a change. Neither seemed like a person expecting their life to end abruptly. Adding to the tension was the fact that in all three cases, there were strange moments in the days just before everything unraveled. For the Hardings, it was Michael purchasing an expensive bottle of wine on his way home from work, something completely out of character when they were supposedly cutting expenses. For the Millers, it was James fixing a broken fence in the middle of the night, as if it couldn't wait until morning. For the Ramirezes, it was Elena baking a cake for the children even though there was no birthday or special occasion. These moments didn't fit neatly into the timelines, and each seemed oddly tender, almost as if they were part of goodbye no one recognized at the time. Meanwhile, subplots began to form around people on the edges of these tragedies. In the Harding neighborhood, a neighbor named Linda became obsessed with understanding what had happened. She collected news clippings, interviewed other residents, and even filed her own requests for police reports. Her fixation wasn't entirely curiosity. She had lost a close friend years earlier under similar, unresolved circumstances, and the Harding case brought all those memories rushing back. In the Miller case, a farmhand who had worked for the family on and off for years claimed he had seen someone parked near the property in the weeks before the tragedy. He described the vehicle as unfamiliar, but his account was vague, and without more details, it was impossible to connect it to anything concrete. Still, the idea that someone might have been watching the farm added a layer of unease that wouldn't go away. And in the Ramirez building, an elderly resident named Mrs. Alvarez swore she had heard someone knock on the family's door late at night, just 2 days before the incident. When she peeked out her peephole, she said she saw a man she didn't recognize standing in the hallway. She couldn't see his face clearly, and no one else claimed to have seen him. Her account was never confirmed, but it lingered in the case file as one of those unexplained details that could mean nothing or everything. Each case also revealed how quickly the absence of answers can pull people apart. In the Harding neighborhood, residents who once gathered for block parties began avoiding each other, their conversations clipped and cautious. Some believed the official version of events, while others were convinced something more sinister had happened. The tension wasn't just in the past. It was in the present, in every sideways glance and awkward silence. In the Miller town, the tragedy divided the community into those who believed the answers were obvious and those who thought the truth had been buried with the family. Old grudges resurfaced, whispered in grocery store aisles and at the edges of church gatherings. The farm, once a symbol of stability, became a quiet reminder of how fragile that stability really was. In the Ramirez building, life went on, but differently. Neighbors locked their doors more often, and children were kept closer to home. The empty apartment stood untouched for months, its windows dark, as if the building itself couldn't quite let go of what had happened there. Despite the differences in setting and circumstance, the main conflict in each story came down to the same haunting theme. How much of a person's life is invisible to everyone around them? Friends, neighbors, even family members only see fragments. They see smiles, routines, small kindnesses, but they rarely see the whole picture until it's too late. And sometimes, even when all the pieces are laid out, the image they form still doesn't make sense. In each case, the more investigators uncovered, the more contradictions appeared. Motives clashed with timelines. Personal accounts didn't match physical evidence. And the few answers they found only seemed to open more questions. One lead detective working on the Miller case once said, "It's like walking into a room where a conversation just ended. You can feel the tension in the air, but you'll never really know what was said. Somewhere within these unanswered questions lies the truth. But until it's found, the mystery keeps growing, branching into new possibilities with every passing year. And as we move into the next cases, the conflicts only deepen, pulling in more people, more secrets, and more moments that can't easily be explained. Because sometimes the most unsettling part of the story isn't what you know. It's what you can't prove." The turning point came when the smallest details began to feel impossibly heavy. In the Harding case, a forgotten voicemail surfaced, Michael's voice, recorded just hours before everything happened. His tone was calm, but there was something in the pauses, a hesitation that didn't sound like him. He mentioned wrapping things up and told the person on the other end to take care of it if I can. Investigators never identified who he called, and the number had since been disconnected. For Rebecca's sister, it was enough to reopen every doubt she tried to bury. For the neighbors, it was a whisper that maybe someone else had been involved all along. At the Miller farm, the strange vehicle sighting took on new weight when another witness came forward, a truck driver passing through late at night. He said he saw headlights flicker on in the distance, then vanish behind a line of trees. At the time, he thought nothing of it, but when he learned the timing matched the night of the tragedy, he couldn't shake the feeling that what he saw wasn't just someone heading home. That detail set off weeks of speculation in town. Some believed it was an intruder. Others whispered it could have been a member of the family meeting someone in secret. In the Ramirez building, a maintenance worker swore he found a scrap of paper wedged behind a radiator in the hallway outside their apartment. The paper was torn and smudged, but a single line was still legible. "We can't go on like this." Whether it was written by Miguel, Elena, or someone else entirely was never proven. But when paired with Mrs. Alvarez's story of the unknown man in the hallway, it pushed the case into an even stranger space. Was this about a private family dispute? Or had someone from the outside been slowly closing in? As these cases reached their most critical points, the tension didn't just live in the evidence. It lived in the people left behind. Linda, the Harding neighbor, became convinced a voicemail was proof of an outside threat. She began leaving notes on the doors of other neighbors, urging them to share what you know before it's too late. Some saw her as a determined truth seeker. Others avoided her entirely, afraid she was stirring up something dangerous. In the Miller town, the farmhand who had spoken about the strange vehicle suddenly stopped answering questions. When asked by reporters why he'd gone silent, he muttered something about not wanting to be next before walking away. That single comment, caught on a local news camera, spread to the community like wildfire, turning the tragedy into something much larger in the public imagination. In the Ramirez building, the hallways felt different, quieter, as if everyone was listening for something they couldn't name. Residents began to notice small things out of place. Mailboxes left open, footsteps in the stairwell late at night, doors that had been closed now standing ajar. Whether these were signs of something real or just the nervousness of community on edge didn't matter. The effect was the same. Everyone was waiting for something to happen again. The investigations began circling around key moments, minutes, even seconds, that could hold the answer. For the Hardings, it was a gap between when Michael left work and when he arrived home that night. For the Millers, it was the unexplained hour between when the last light went off in the farmhouse and when the neighbor saw the truck door hanging open. For the Ramirezes, it was a 10-minute window when someone entered the building through a side door, never recorded leaving. As these threads tightened, so did the sense that time was running out, not to prevent the past, but to stop whatever might still be unfolding in the shadows. Detectives began to suspect that, in at least one of these cases, the story wasn't over. Evidence suggested there might be someone still out there, someone who knew exactly what had happened, and who was making sure the truth stayed buried. Each lead seemed to pull the cases toward a single, inevitable point, though no one could see it clearly yet. The voicemail, the headlights in the trees, the note behind the radiator, all of them felt connected somehow, like pieces from 3 different puzzles that, when forced together, started to form a new and unsettling picture. And then, almost without warning, the moment came when everything was about to tip. For the Hardings, it was a discovery of a locked drawer in Michael's desk, the key to which was found in a place no one expected. For the Millers, it was a late-night phone call to the sheriff's office from an unlisted number, a voice on the line saying only, "Check the well," before hanging up. For the Ramirezes, it was the sound of someone knocking on the vacant apartment door, long, deliberate knocks, heard by multiple residents at the same time. By then, the tension was like a wire pulled too tight, humming with the weight of everything unsaid. The next step for each case felt inevitable, and yet no one could predict exactly what would come to light. All they knew was that the truth, whatever it was close enough to feel, but still just out of reach. And as the clock moved toward those final moments, the question that had haunted every case from the beginning only grew louder. When the truth finally shows itself, will it bring answers or something much darker? Just when it seemed the cases were converging toward their breaking point, something unexpected happened. Details emerged that didn't just deepen the mystery, they completely shifted the ground beneath it. In the Harding investigation, the locked drawer finally gave way, revealing not financial papers as many had expected, but a stack of letters, each addressed to someone with the same unfamiliar name. None were signed, but all were written in Rebecca's handwriting. The letters hinted at a relationship, or perhaps a confidant, describing fears and plans in vague but urgent language. One line stood out more than the rest. "If he finds out, I don't know what he'll do." Investigators had assumed he referred to Michael, but what if it didn't? In the Miller case, deputies followed the strange phone tip and drained the well. What they found wasn't physical evidence, but a collection of old items, family heirlooms, documents, and personal keepsakes that should have been inside the farmhouse. Someone had gone to the trouble of hiding them there. Mixed in with the belongings was something else. A small, rusted tin box containing a set of keys and a folded piece of paper with an address written on it. That address led to a storage unit 3 towns over, rented under a name that didn't match anyone in the family. And in the Ramirez case, the mystery of the late-night knocks deepened when security footage from a nearby store surfaced. The camera caught a man standing across the street from the apartment building at nearly the same time the knocks were heard. He wasn't facing the building. He was facing away, as if keeping watch for something behind him. His face was never visible, and his car, parked in the shadows, had its license plate removed. This new angle suggested that the knocks weren't random. They were part of something bigger, possibly even staged to send a message to someone still living in the building. These discoveries didn't answer any questions. They multiplied them. Who was the person named in Rebecca's letters? And why had she hidden them? Who placed the Miller family's possessions in the well? And what was in the storage unit? And what was the purpose of the knocks at the Ramirez apartment? Were they a warning, a threat, or something more cryptic? The stakes rose sharply when evidence from one case began to bleed into another. A handwriting analysis, initially run just to confirm the authorship of Rebecca's letters, revealed a partial match to a note found years earlier in an unsolved case in the Miller town. It wasn't a definitive link, but it was enough to make investigators wonder if there was a thread connecting these tragedies across distance and time. Then came the biggest jolt yet. A set of fingerprints from the Ramirez security footage car door matched an unidentified print taken from an object in the Harding home. This was no longer a matter of coincidence. The same person, or at least someone moving between these circles, had left a trace in both places. But how? There was no known connection between the families. No shared acquaintances, no overlapping locations. The revelation changed everything for the people living in those communities. For the Harding's neighbors, it meant the tragedy might not have been as contained as they'd hoped. For the Miller town, it meant the possibility that someone they'd never considered was moving quietly among them. For the Ramirez building, it meant that whatever it caused their loss might not be over. The second plot twist wasn't just that the cases might be connected. It was that the connection was alive, active, and possibly still operating. Suddenly, the timelines weren't just about what had happened in the past. They were about what might be happening now, unseen. And as the pressure mounted, a new, sharper fear took hold. Not just what had happened behind closed doors, but the idea that someone was still out there, weaving these tragedies together into a pattern no one had fully recognized yet. The question was no longer if the truth would come out. It was whether anyone would be ready for it when it did. The breakthrough came when detectives finally gained access to the Miller storage unit. Inside, beneath dusty tarps and old furniture, they found a single locked trunk. When they pried it open, the air inside was stale, carrying a faint metallic scent. The trunk contained stacks of manila folders, police reports, newspaper clippings, and personal photographs of families from different towns and states. The Hardings, the Millers, and the Ramirezes were all there, along with several other families who had suffered similar tragedies. Some of the reports were decades old, others recent. Whoever had collected them wasn't just interested in one case. They had been watching, tracking, and possibly orchestrating events for years. Among the files was a set of handwritten notes in the same style as Rebecca Harding's letters. They weren't dated, but they referenced events from all 3 cases, describing them in chilling detail before they had even happened. One page mentioned setting the stage in the Millertown months before the tragedy. Another referred to getting closer in the Ramirez building. The handwriting analysis confirmed the impossible. It matched both Rebecca's letters and the mysterious note from the Miller case. This discovery forced a re-examination of everything. Rebecca's letters had never been private confessions to a friend or family member. They had been part of a larger correspondence with someone who seemed to have knowledge of multiple families. The identity on the storage unit's lease, though fake, led police to a P.O. box registered under yet another false name. But security footage from the post office caught a clear image of the person retrieving mail, a middle-aged woman no one recognized at first. It took days to connect her to Linda, the Harding neighbor who had been so determined to find the truth. She had lived in all 3 locations over the past 20 years, always moving on shortly after a tragedy struck nearby. Neighbors in those towns recalled her as friendly, helpful, and oddly curious about other people's lives. She'd volunteered in community events, attended local meetings, and quietly gathered details about those around her. When confronted, Linda didn't deny her presence in each place, but she refused to explain why she had the files or how she'd known events before they happened. She claimed she was documenting patterns for a personal project, but the vagueness of her answers only made the tension worse. Investigators couldn't prove she had directly caused any of the tragedies, but the evidence of her proximity and knowledge was impossible to ignore. In the Ramirez building, residents who had seen her occasionally visiting a friend on the 4th floor now realized they had no idea who that friend actually was. In the Miller town, old photos surfaced of her attending the county fair, standing just a few feet from a family she would later be tied through the storage unit. And in the Harding neighborhood, people remembered how she had always seemed to be looking, not just at them, but through them, as if trying to piece together something only she understood. The climax hit when investigators revealed that the fingerprints linking the Harding and Ramirez cases weren't from Linda at all. They belonged to an unidentified man who appeared alongside her in surveillance images from years earlier. His face was always obscured, his presence always just in the background. It became clear that Linda wasn't acting alone, whether she was working with him for him or tracking him the same way she tracked the families. No one could say for certain. The official investigations closed with more answers than they started with, but not all. The tragedies were linked by a web of observation, planning, and proximity, yet the ultimate motive remained out of reach. Families got closure in the sense that the connection was real, but it was an incomplete truth, one that carried its own unease. The final twist came quietly. Weeks after Linda was questioned and released, a resident of the Ramirez building reported seeing her again, not in person, but in a photograph from a local event posted online. She was standing in the crowd at a school fundraiser in another state, watching a family pose for pictures. The image was dated just 3 days earlier. It left everyone with the same sinking realization. The pattern wasn't over. And somewhere, someone was already part of the next story, one that hadn't happened yet. In the weeks after climax, the shock slowly settled into something heavier, a quiet awareness that life in these communities would never fully return to the way it was. The police officially labeled the Harding, Miller, and Ramirez cases connected by circumstance, carefully avoiding language that could imply a coordinated series of crimes without undeniable proof. But for the people who had lived through them, there was no question anymore. They knew the threads were real, even if they couldn't see where they ended. For the Harding neighborhood, the discovery of Rebecca's letters and the link to Linda brought both relief and discomfort. Relief, because it meant there was at least some explanation for why certain things had never made sense. Discomfort, because the explanation didn't feel complete. Neighbors began talking to one another again, though cautiously, exchanging memories to see if anything else stood out in hindsight. Some remembered small, seemingly harmless interactions with Linda, an offer to watch their kids, a casual question about who was home during the day. That now felt loaded with meaning. The block parties never returned, but a quiet bond formed between those who had stayed, as if surviving the same story made them part of something unspoken. In the Miller town, the storage unit discovery confirmed old suspicions about outside influence, but the absence of a clear motive left many unsettled. The sheriff, a lifelong resident, admitted during a town meeting that he didn't believe the story was over. That statement became the quiet truth locals carried with them. The farm, empty and overgrown, became a place people avoided, not out of fear of what happened there, but of what it represented. A reminder that danger didn't always come from strangers in dark alleys, but sometimes from faces you knew, from people who waved at you in the grocery store. For the Ramirez building, life began to move again, though the vacant apartment remained empty, its door secured with a heavy padlock. The late-night knocks stopped, but the memory of them lingered in the minds of the residents. Mrs. Alvarez, the elderly tenant who had seen the man in the hallway, became something of an unofficial historian for the building. She kept a notebook of everything she remembered, times, dates, small details, just in case. "You never know when they'll come asking again," she'd say, and no one questioned who they were. As for Linda, her disappearance after being seen in that online photo added another layer to the mystery. Police said they had no active warrant for her arrest and no grounds to detain her without concrete evidence. She was technically a free woman, but in the minds of many, she had become something more than a person. She was a symbol of unanswered questions, of the unsettling idea that someone could stand so close to tragedy without leaving obvious fingerprints, yet still shape its course. The unidentified man in the background of her surveillance images remain nameless. Despite sharing his prints between agencies, no match ever came back. It was as if he existed only in the periphery, never fully stepping into the light. This fueled theories that he might have been the one pulling strings, with Linda acting as his eyes and ears. Others believe it was the opposite, that she was the orchestrator, and he was simply another shadow in the story. When reporters revisited the family's histories, a subtle pattern emerged, one that tied not just the three main cases together, but hinted at others. In each, there had been moments of kindness from strangers in the weeks before the tragedies. A neighbor dropping off food unexpectedly, someone offering help with home repairs, a familiar face showing up at community events for no clear reason. These gestures, innocent on their own, took on a darker tone when viewed through the lens of the pattern. Were they truly random, or were they part of a deliberate process of getting close, learning the rhythms of a family before the breaking point? The resolution, in many ways, came not from catching a suspect or closing files, but from the way people chose to live afterward. The Hardings' neighbors started checking in on each other more, not out of suspicion, but out of genuine care. In the Miller town, residents organized a volunteer watch program, not just patrol, but to stay connected, sharing what they saw and heard. In the Ramirez building, people who had once kept to themselves began knocking on each other's doors for coffee or conversation, deciding that isolation had been part of the problem. For the families directly affected, closure was a complicated thing. It didn't mean forgetting or even fully understanding. It meant finding a way to keep going despite the gaps in the story. Rebecca's sister kept the letters, storing them in a safe place, not ready to destroy them, but not able to read them again either. The Miller family's surviving relatives reclaimed the heirlooms from the well, cleaning and restoring them piece by piece, a small act of reclaiming what had been taken. In the Ramirez case, the children's relatives moved them to another city, far from the building, hoping distance might give them a chance at a fresh start. The final takeaway from these connected tragedies was something that spread far beyond the towns and cities involved. True crime enthusiasts, community safety advocates, and everyday people began talking about what these cases revealed. The importance of paying attention to small changes, of trusting instincts, and of recognizing that sometimes the danger isn't loud or obvious. It's quiet, patient, watching. Yet the story never tied itself into a perfect knot. The last, unexpected twist came months later, when a package arrived at the Miller Sheriff's Office with no return address. Inside was a single Polaroid photograph. It showed a street in an unfamiliar town, children playing in the yard of a small house. Standing at the edge of the frame, barely in focus, was Linda. She was holding a camera. No note came with it. No explanation. Just an image. A reminder that somewhere another family might already be part of the next file in the trunk. The photograph was logged as evidence, but unofficially, it became something else. The quiet, haunting conclusion to a story that had given as many questions as it had answers. And so, the cases were filed away, their details preserved for anyone who might pick them up again one day. The Hardings, the Millers, the Ramirezes, They became names in a pattern that no one could fully map, but that everyone could feel. A pattern that taught one unforgettable lesson. Sometimes the scariest truths aren't the ones you uncover. They're the ones you never fully see. Because even when the story seems to end, somewhere out there, the next chapter might already be starting.